Hey guys, it's Linux Next here. In today's video, we are going to be looking at the Linux kernel 6.14. It has released around an hour ago. But when I post this, it's not going to be an hour ago. But we're going to be looking at the new features that are included in this new kernel. Now, the first big feature that has arrived in the Linux kernel 6.14, and that is the NTSYNC driver. Now, if you don't know what this driver really does, in a sense, it is the synchronization between the Windows APIs being translated to Wine so that Wine can understand what is going on, and you mostly with things like the older synchronizations like F-Sync and E-Sync, usually there's some things missing when it comes to that synchronization, and so some issues like performance may occur. And so this new driver, the NTSYNC driver, has been worked on for around a year and a half or something like that now by code weavers, who are the developers who work on Wine. And the issues that were left with this synchronization, well, they had to go and make a driver in the kernel, and that's why NTSYNC has been merged into kernel 6.14, as it is done when it comes to a driver that can be used in Wine for things like improving gaming performance is one example, and overall just improving the compatibility when running Wine software on Linux. Now, with all the articles about NTSYNC, I think there's one big misunderstanding, and it's this picture right here. This screenshot of the original merge request, which showed the comparison between NTSYNC and upstream. Now, what they mean by upstream is with no any type of synchronization being used. It is no F-Sync, no E-Sync. So this is why you see upstream 69, funny number, on Angerfoot game, but you look at NTSYNC, it's 99. But this developer didn't show a comparison between F-Sync or E-Sync. So when I do, because I'm going to do a video about NTSYNC and verse it against F-Sync, because that's the most used one today, and E-Sync, which is a bit older, that's not really used anymore, and maybe only used for some games, you'll see that there's not really that big of an actual difference when it comes to something like NTSYNC versus F-Sync. So even though this driver is going to improve a ton of things and just make the compatibility with Windows software and games, it's not a magical FPS boost that people seem to think that it is. You'll see improvements on maybe frame timing, it will probably look a lot more smoother, and you may actually see some FPS improvements in some games. Now, this is just the kernel driver that has been merged. There is still one part that needs to finish, and that is in the user space of actual Wine. So this merge request is opened right now. It's been open for around, I think, a month or so, and well, this needs to be merged. If it can't be merged, then regular Wine can't take advantage of it. So the latest release of Wine, it's not going to be able to use the NTSYNC driver in the kernel. What you'll need is a custom runner that has the patch. So something maybe like Wine TKG might have it, or Proton TKG might have it also, or something like Caches OS Proton, which does actually have the NTSYNC driver implemented on an older version. So until this gets merged, you're going to have to use those types of runners, and then when it gets merged, Wine will do a release that will include that NTSYNC driver support so you can actually use it. Then Proton will have to rebase to that Wine version that includes it, or they probably could add it themselves, I guess maybe early, but best bet probably is that Proton's going to rebase onto that Wine version, and then you're going to be able to use NTSYNC probably by default when using a regular version of Proton. But nonetheless, really awesome to see that the NTSYNC driver has been merged, and it seems like it is actually ready for like consumer level use. Now, when it comes to what has Valve been up to in the Linux kernel recently, well, in 6.14, they merged something under a weird name, which was QH Electronics, which I'm guessing is a vendor that creates controllers for particular devices, which the device that they were actually supporting was the Lenovo Legion Go S controller support. So originally this post came out by Michael, and he said, thanks to Valve, another Xbox 360 compatible game controller will see support with the upstream XPad input driver with the upcoming Linux 6.14 kernel. Well-known Valve employee Pierre, with their Linux efforts, authored the patch adding support for the QH electronics controller to the XPad driver. As most of the knockoff game controllers, they're straight up compatible with the XPad driver thanks to complying with the Xbox controller specifications after simply adding the needed vendor device ID. The patch adding the QH electronics controller support to the XPad driver was queued up this week into the input subsystem next branch. And it says down here, I haven't been able to dig up much of the QH electronics controller itself, and the original mailing list patch post didn't shed any further insight on it, but evidently notable enough for a Valve developer to tackle, adding the Linux support for it. So as you can see, Michael didn't know what controller was actually being added. It was under some obscure name posted by Pierre, and it was actually the Lenovo Legion Go S controller support that was being added. As it says here, Valve is supporting Lenovo with Legion Go S gaming handheld running their Arch Linux-based SteamOS. Beyond the fanfare at CES, Valve has been collaborating with Lenovo on engineering resources for ensuring the Legion Go S is running well with SteamOS, and in turn, the mainline Linux kernel. It turns out from a recent sneaky patch, Valve quietly added support to the Linux kernel for what ended up being the Lenovo Legion Go S controller / input handling. Last month I wrote about the QH controller being added to the XPad driver for the mainline Linux kernel by Pierre, who is known for his Linux contributions. I was able to find much at all about the QH electronics controller beyond the patch mentioned itself, but as I wrote in that earlier article, and then it turns out it was notably a contribution indeed. The addition was really a placeholder codename fake product to conceal the support being for the Lenovo Legion Go S. As a patch series this weekend unfolded that mystery with renaming the QH electronics controller to the Lenovo Legion Go S. So really cool that Valve is actually implementing drivers directly in the kernel for this support, which means that, you know, I'm guessing already distros like Bazzite, for example, have already brought in that patch probably into their own kernel so that people that have the Lenovo Legion Go S Windows version can install Bazzite on it, and then they'll be able to get that controller driver support out of the box, and then Bazzite doesn't have to do really anything when it comes to the support side of things because it already works. And one of the next new features that are arriving in 6.14 is about being able to use the Microsoft Copilot key on the new Windows laptops. So here, newer laptops preloaded with Microsoft Windows have begun adding a Copilot key for launching Microsoft's Copilot AI Assistant or other chatbot software. With the upcoming Linux 6.14 kernel, that key will be mapped out correctly so that the user space software can determine the behavior for handling that key's action on the Linux desktop. A change made to the ATKBD keyboard driver on Linux now maps the F23 key to support the default Copilot shortcut action. The patch, authored by Lenovo engineer Mark Pearson, explains. And that's surprising that there's a Lenovo engineer, providing a driver or, patch for supporting this. This is pretty cool. Microsoft defined Meta plus Shift plus F23 as the Copilot shortcut instead of a dedicated key code, and multiple vendors have their keyboards emit this sequence in response to users pressing a dedicated Copilot key. Unfortunately, the default key map table in ATKBD does not map scan code OX6E F23, and so the key combination does not work even if user space is ready to handle it. Because this behavior is common between multiple vendors and the scan code is currently unused, map 0x6E to key code 193 key underscore F23 so that key sequence is generated properly. Now it's up to the Linux desktop environments for determining what to do if the new Copilot key is pressed. So for something like KDE Plasma, they may leave it to the user to decide what they want to map that to, or maybe it'll be mapped to something by default in something like KDE Plasma or GNOME, or maybe even like desktops like Cosmic, for example. So really cool to see, because that was one thing that I was thinking about when they were, Microsoft was going to add the Copilot key into laptops directly. I was like, well, what about Linux? Like, is Linux going to be able to utilize that keybind so you can actually, map it to something, or by default it'll be mapped to something? And yeah, it's gonna come in 6.14, so that's really cool. And then if you own some newer Intel laptops, there has been a driver support for the Intel THC, which basically is a touch host controller IP found on modern Intel PCH for notebooks for enhancing touchscreen, touchpad, and stylus input handling, among other related functionality with recent Intel laptops. So as it says here, is the name of the IP block in PCH, the interface with touch devices, touchscreen, touchpad, etc. And then into addition with that, with the HID updates, there also has been support for this headset, which is the SteelSeries ARCTIS 9 wireless headset support. So if you do own this headset, it's now able to actually report statistics to your Linux system about its like battery life, and maybe some other things, maybe some charging as well. As it says here, the SteelSeries HID driver has been used for enabling extra functionality under Linux with various SteelSeries products, like for exposing battery charging controls and similar functionality. The SteelSeries ARCTIS 9 wireless headset is now seeing similar treatment with patches posted on Wednesday. The SteelSeries Linux driver is being exposed for the ARCTIS 9 wireless headset to support exposing the battery information under Linux, charging state information, and other helpful information. So really cool. If you own this headset, this gaming wireless headset, you're now able to use it in Linux 6.14. And when it comes to suspend and resume in kernel 6.14, it is going to be substantially faster now. So see, alongside the power management and thermal driver updates this week for the ongoing Linux 6.14 kernel cycle, were also the ACPI updates. The ACPI pull request was worth calling out on its own thanks to a change that will allow for faster suspend and resume cycles on some systems with this new kernel. The ACPI change worth highlighting for Linux 6.14 is switching from msleep to usleep range within the ACPI OS sleep call in the kernel. And so when we look down here, it says the change noted another Dell XPS laptop going from a kernel resume time of 1.9 seconds down to 1.1 seconds. That's quite an improvement with this change. So with that, you're going to get just way better suspend and resume on Linux laptops, I would say. That's an amazing improvement on Linux laptops, I would say. And when it comes to the AMD AI side of things, the AMD XDNA driver is arriving in 6.14, which is pretty cool. So if you're able to get a CPU that has a NPU with it, you should be able to actually use that now, actually utilize it on Linux with kernel 6.14, in particular software that is allowed to or to support in using this driver. As it says here, with the AMD XDNA kernel driver for Ryzen AI NPU support on Linux now ready for merging and is queued in DRM is next for the Linux 6.14 kernel early next year. The AMD NPU firmware binaries have also now been upstreamed to Linux firmware.git for having the necessary firmware support in place. Merged today into Linux firmware.git were the 3 AMD NPU binaries for supporting the various Ryzen AI NPUs that have begun to be found and Ryzen laptops over the past 2 years. These firmware binaries are needed by the open source AMD XDNA kernel driver for actually being able to engage the neural processing unit. With this commit, the initial firmware is now upstreamed in Linux firmware.git, so those binaries can be easily picked up by the different Linux distributions ahead of updating to the Linux 6.14 kernel in the new year. Now, when it comes to the graphics side of things, instead of more about laptops, more of like desktop, but this is supported on laptops also, is about AMD preps many graphics driver updates for Linux 6.14 and DRM panic support. So AMD today sent out a first batch of new stuff feature patches to DRM Next of new code for their AMD GPU kernel graphics driver and AMD KFD compute driver of material for the Linux 6.14 kernel cycle. This first of likely multiple pull requests of the new AMD kernel graphics/compute driver feature updates planned for the 6.14 is quite large. There are updates updates for the number of graphics IP blocks, including various RDNA4 3.5 related updates, GC 9.5 updates over on the NTSYNC/CDNA side for AMD KFD, and other updates. Plus, there is support for resetting the SDMA queue as needed, panel replay fixes, DisplayPort tunneling fixes, reporting around missing optional firmware is now less noisy in the kernel log, logging improvements for AMD KFD, various AMD KFD driver optimization, and also DRM panic support. The DRM panic support for AMD graphics is to enjoy the recent Linux blue screen of death functionality in the case of kernel errors and being able to display QR code error messages. So if you get a kernel panic, you're going to get this new screen on AMD if you're on kernel 6.14, and it will show a nice QR code which you can scan to go and report this issue, which I'm pretty sure if you scan it, it's probably going to have like all the logs and everything already compiled for you, so you can actually send it to the developers. As I'm pretty sure, if this happened to a regular user, they would need to provide logs, and I'm pretty sure this QR code will provide that, so you can easily just report it to the necessary developers. So really freaking cool that this is finally coming to AMD users. And if you want to read further, there is a full summary of what is being included. But overall, really good. And when it comes to, there's not just like that one, there is more that did come around also, which is AMD preps more GPU driver fixes for Linux 6.14, cleaner shader for RDNA desktop GPUs. So on Friday, AMD sent out another round of patches that are destined for the upcoming Linux 6.14 kernel cycle. Being late in the kernel 6.13 cycle, and already several rounds of feature pull requests merged to DRM next over prior weeks, this week's batch of AMD GPU/AMD KFD kernel driver updates is mostly about fixes and stabilizing new code for Linux 6.14. Over the past month, a lot of new feature code was queued in DRM next, like the DRM panic support and continued work around new RDNA4 graphics support. One new feature enabled by this latest pull request is cleaner shader support for GFX 10.3 discrete GPUs, aka the Radeon RX 6000/RDNA2 discrete graphics cards. So if you do own one like me, you're going to benefit from this cleaner shader support. AMD's cleaner shader is for helping ensure user/app isolation. The cleaner shader helps ensure each process has a clean environment and reducing the risk of any data leakage between processes. The AMD cleaner shader was already enabled for RDNA3 and Nulla, while now it's come for GFX 10.3/RDNA2. And then there's even more patches that have been merged into the AMD GPU and the AMD KFD. So I'm going to leave all of these links down below where you can go and read like the full pull request if you really want to go in depth. But really cool that we're getting the cleaner shader support on RDNA2 for different application processes, so there's no data leakage, and the kernel panic support. And then there's also lots of different patches for RDNA 3.5, RDNA 3, and then there's also RDNA 4 patches coming in. Also, as we can see here, AMD squeezes in more RDNA 4 changes for Linux 6.14, enables cleaner shader on GFX 12. So while the main feature pool of new and updated kernel graphics accelerator drivers were merged already for the ongoing Linux 6.14 merge window, an additional set of AMD GPU changes were sent out this week for squeezing into this next kernel release. Friday's pull request of additional AMD GPU, AMD KFD material is mostly about bug fixes for existing and newly introduced issues in Linux 6.14, but there's some items worth mentioning, particularly for the GFX 12 graphics engine with the upcoming RDNA4/Radeon RX 97 series graphics. So in addition to the GFX 12 improvements/fixes merged for the main Linux 6.14 merge, Friday's pull request brings further GFX 12 fixes. Additionally, it now enables cleaner shader support for GFX 12. The cleaner shader is for helping ensuring app user isolations, which is what we already talked about. And then Linux 6.14 is enabling cleaner shader for GFX 12, 12.0.1 GPUs to clear GPU resources like the local data share, vector general proposed registers, and scalar general proposed registers registers between workloads. By clearing these resources between workloads, it helps prevent possible data leakage and ensures better security/reliability with the upcoming RDNA4 graphics cards. GFX 9 through GFX 11 IP has already seen cleaner shader enablement. I haven't seen any public communication from AMD driver developers about their motivation for adding these cleaner shader functionality at this stage, as opposed to something that could have been done years ago. If it's due to new customer demands, security concerns, or other factors, in any event, this cleaner shader support is particularly useful for today's multi-tenant GPU accelerated systems, and even when just running untrusted code on your system with GPU access. So overall, when it comes to the AMD side, it's looking pretty damn good. Both on RDNA4, and this is what I've said multiple times to anyone that owns a RDNA4 GPU, you should be using at least kernel 6.13, but it seems like kernel 6.14 has a lot more patches included in RDNA4. So I would prefer, if you are like a new owner of an RDNA4 GPU, that you use kernel 6.14, the newest Linux firmware package, and try and use either the newest Mesa version. If you still have issues, you have to go to Mesa Git, which is the master version of Mesa / the latest patches that are available, but they're not in like a binary release, they're in the Git repo. So it's like mostly experimental patches, which if you're on something like Arch, for example, you can just use an AOR version of MesaGit to get those loaded patches and to see if that improves things, which it should, based on my research that I've done with many users that have switched over to a Git version of Mesa. But if you don't want to move over to a Git version of Mesa, you are going to have to wait for Mesa 25.1, which it should be coming in around May, I'm pretty sure, is when that's going to get released. And if you are someone that is, let's say, bug reporting something, and you like to look at a lot of like boot logs or kernel logs or systemd logs, flatpak logs, all that stuff. Well, when it comes to the boot logs, there is a new DRM boot logger for kernel messages. Sent out today was the latest DRM MISC next pull request for various direct rendering manager DRM changes queuing up ahead of the Linux 6.14 kernel cycle. Most exciting this week is the DRM boot logger being queued up for landing to better present kernel messages. Being developed by Red Hat's, I don't know how to say that name in particular, as part of work on the DRM panic infrastructure is DRM log as a new kernel message boot logger. This effort was covered a few months ago on PHORONIX, with DRM log continues to be worked on as a new boot logger for kernel messages. This new DRM log code is just about rendering kernel messages to the screen and not handling user input or any other extra functionality better accomplished by user space. This log viewer by design doesn't allow scrolling past kernel messages, uses the non-blocking console API, so it's compatible with real-time RT kernels, works with all DRM drivers, and is intended to just get the job done until a user space solution is ready to take over after boot. One nice ability with this DRM log code is integrated scaling support for increasing the text size as desired for dealing with modern high DPI displays. So if you are interested in that, it's really cool that now that's going to be in kernel 6.14. And when it comes to the processor side of Linux 6.14, there has been an improvement for the AMD preferred core. It says being merged back in the Linux 6.9 kernel was AMD preferred core support within the AMD P-State driver for being able to communicate the preferred cores to the kernel for those that are able to reach a higher maximum frequency or otherwise be preferred over other CPU cores. For the upcoming Linux 6.14 merge window, an important set of patches are queued up for better positioning these preferred core handling. With Linux 6.14, the Linux kernel will be able to support dynamic preferred core rankings. The existing Linux kernel code around ITMT, Intel Turbo Boost Max Tech code that is leveraged by AMD, the core rankings are treated as static, but with AMD preferred core, the preferred core rankings can change dynamically at runtime. Thus, a set of patches have been worked on by AMD in recent months for allowing the rankings to be dynamically updated within the kernel. So that is really cool, and that's going to just improve the overall performance when it comes to the CPU in general, with which preferred core should be ranked, I guess, highest and it can just do it dynamically. That's pretty damn cool, I would say. And when it comes to the Intel CPU side of things, there has been a new thermal driver support for the new Intel Panther Lake, or the 16th generation of Intel CPUs. So Intel's upstreaming work around the next-gen Core Ultra Panther Lake processors continues with the Linux kernel, among other code being prepped for submitting during the Linux 16.14 merge window. On Monday, the thermal driver updates were focused on enabling support for Intel Panther Lake processors. The thermal control updates were sent out on Monday for 6.14, and the notable material there is simply preparing support for the Intel Panther Lake processors as the successor to Lunar Lake and Arrow Lake. This follows other Panther Lake hardware enablement upstreaming that was found in 6.13 and continuing for this 6.14 cycle. So really awesome to see that Intel developers are trying to get those drivers brought in for 6.14, and you'll be able to utilize it probably when Panther Lake comes out. I don't know when Panther Lake is coming out, probably sometime this year, but when it does, you'll be able to utilize the drivers already in the Linux kernel, and you'll just have probably a pretty good experience. And there is plenty of other patches and drivers and improvements that are in kernel 6.14 that I didn't talk about. I just tried to bring out the most important things, I would say, when it comes to the viewers that are watching this channel. So, but I will link everything down below when it comes to the things that I did mention, and then a full summary of everything else that wasn't mentioned in this video by Michael on PHORONIX, who will just, he does so much research about Linux stuff in general, so you can go and read all that for the rest of the things. So if you guys did enjoy this video, I definitely would give it a like. I definitely would subscribe to the channel, and I want to know your thoughts about 6.14. Are you excited for it? Are you pleased to see what is included in this release? Because I am pleased personally. There is a lot of things included in this that are just going to improve the Linux desktop experience, I would say, when it comes to RDNA4 GPUs, when it comes to the cleaner shader stuff, when it comes to control support with the Lenovo Legion Go S, and plenty of other things, I would say, and especially the NTSYNC driver finally arriving. And thank you to my supporters. I'll show a text across the screen. They're giving me money every single month. I'm sorry, also, I am still sick, but since 6.14 just came out, I had to make a video about it because, well, it's an important release with important changes, so I should make a video about it. And yeah, so I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.